My name is Susie Singer-Carter, and I'm an award-winning filmmaker and activist for nursing home reform. For the past 2 years, I've been working on a documentary called No Country for Old People that exposes the decades-old systemic corruption in our broken nursing home system. The film chronicles the unimaginable last 6 months of my mother's life in a 5-star nursing home here in Los Angeles in 2022, the direct result of systemic neglect. This neglect was made even more transparent during the COVID pandemic. My mother had Alzheimer's and used a wheelchair, but she was very social. But during the pandemic, she was left in bed and severely neglected. I was locked out from my mother for 15 months. And during that time, I could not advocate for her well-being. This was a direct violation of her rights under the 1987 Nursing Home Reform Act. Contact with my mother continued to be very limited until she became gravely ill. I had no idea until she was admitted into the hospital with a stage 4 pressure wound on her lower back that had been left untreated. She had sepsis, a severe urinary tract infection, 10% kidney function, and grave dehydration. I'm just one of thousands of family members across the United States who are not allowed access to their loved ones in long-term care facilities. Instead, we watch them from windows and iPads as our loved ones declined or died. This is why I strongly encourage you to support the Essential Caregivers Act, a bipartisan bicameral bill that will allow at least one family member or friend, essential caregiver, in-person access to their loved one during the next declared federal, state, or local emergency, while requiring them to follow the same safety protocols as staff. Please take a moment to watch these stories featuring one person from each of our 50 states who represent thousands from their state who experienced the same trauma of being locked out from their loved one for months and years during the COVID pandemic. There's also a link providing more information at the end of this video. Please support the Essential Caregivers Act because these stories could be yours. Thank you.
My name is Wendy Holmes-Keeler. I'm a state and ASHA licensed speech-language pathologist who also worked in the nursing home where my father was receiving services in 2020. While I was lucky to be able to see my father, I was not able to see him on days I wasn't working, as I was not allowed in the building. Our residents were not allowed to leave their rooms for over a year and a half. They could not open their windows for fresh air, and many did not get out of bed.
My name is Denise Brown. My mom spent the last 4 days of her life without hospice personnel in the facility because they all had COVID. It was the isolation of being moved up to the top floor during the lockdown that caused her to ultimately give up her will to live. Because prior to that, we could visit her outside her window on the first floor and she could look at the Alaska scenery. They didn't allow her to leave her room or even let her have her door open because she left the building to go into kidney dialysis.
I'm Rachel Sanchez. My mother died after only 4 months of the lockdown. My siblings and I fought for access, and after 3 months, we were allowed in. She had lost a great deal of weight by that time. When we came in, we watched the staff bring her a chicken leg for lunch, which she was unable to eat because she was supposed to get her food mechanically chopped. That's when we understood how she became malnourished.
My name is Veronica Tess Myers. I'm in Arkansas. I am here to talk about my denial of access to my father in a nursing home facility during the COVID pandemic. When I was able to actually get an appointment, it was a window visit. My father was brought to the window in his wheelchair and left there alone with no assistance. I saw that he was nearly falling out of the chair. He had no strength to keep himself up or to keep from falling. Yet I could see his eyes bulging out of his head, hoping that he didn't fall and that someone could possibly save him. My father, as with any of our loved ones, are human beings. They have feelings, they have emotions, they need touch, they need to hear a loved one's voice instead of being left in solitary and in isolation.
I'm Shelley Devon. After I watched my mother decline in her facility in the first 6 months of the pandemic, due to the poor care given to her, I got a license as a California home health care aide and got hired by a temporary agency. I saw staff not following safety protocols, carpet workers laying new carpet inside the facility, and incredible neglect as the staffing was so short. My mom's care continued to be neglected during the hours I wasn't there.
I'm Michelle White. My father thrived in an independent facility before the pandemic. My aunt would visit him multiple times a day to give him his medication. After the pandemic lockdown began, he experienced a drastic decline in cognition and was not allowed to see an audiologist for new hearing aids. He was moved 4 times to other facilities. He couldn't understand why my aunt and I weren't coming to see him, and he started wandering, which is why he ended up in a locked memory care facility. He passed away in June 2022 with full-blown dementia.
My name is Candace Ramirez, and I'm a registered nurse in the state of Connecticut. I was in my late teens, early 20s, working as a nurse in a hospital setting when the AIDS epidemic occurred. It was a time of pure fear when we did not understand how the AIDS virus spread. Once we knew how the AIDS virus spread, we protected ourselves with personal protective equipment and carried on as usual to care for our patients. Once we knew how to protect ourselves from COVID by wearing masks and face shields, caregivers should not have been kept away from their loved ones for such a long period of time. My mother currently resides in a nursing home, and she requires total care due to her advanced Alzheimer's disease. If we were not able to be there for my mother, her needs would not be adequately met.
I'm Heidi Sokesh, and I am a special education supervisor. My mom was kept in a room by herself with no interaction. In 3 months, she lost 30 pounds and was under 90 pounds. They dropped off her tray of food and returned 30 minutes later to take it away, even though her food was all there. She was starving at the hands of the people that were supposed to be taking care of her.
I'm Mary Daniel, the founder of Caregivers for Compromise, the Facebook group with over 14,000 members that I started in July of 2020 after I took a job as a dishwasher at my husband Steve's memory care center so that I could be with him during the lockdowns. While advocating for a state essential caregiver law, I asked a very simple question. Why can I touch my husband as a dishwasher, but I can't touch him as his wife? Thankfully, on September the 1st of 2020, our governor lifted the lockdown order and all Florida caregivers were able to be with their loved ones again with no uptick in COVID cases. Steve passed away in December of 2022, and I'm continuing to fight for federal legislation to ensure that no one is ever isolated again.
I'm Emily Main. It was difficult to communicate with either my mom or the staff during the lockdown. I was told to hang on because better days were coming. Instead, my mother passed away and a nurse found her dead during a routine check.
I'm Melissa Fisher. My dad's facility cost $15,000 a month out of pocket. After I was vaccinated, he was vaccinated, all the residents were vaccinated, and the staff were vaccinated. He was still only allowed access to one loved one every 2 weeks for 1 hour. So if I wanted to see him, my mom had to wait a month to see him again.
I'm Pat Ferriola. My husband passed away December 20th, 2020, after 9 months of isolation. It was also our youngest daughter's birthday and 5 days from Christmas. He was the rock of our family. Our hearts were broken, and we will never be the same as a family.
I'm Carrie Welchdahl, and I have an adult son who lives in an intermediate care facility for adults with developmental disabilities. Lynn was born with a rare seizure disorder and is developmentally delayed. I was not allowed to see Lynn for 125 days, and then I was only allowed to see him because he had a doctor's appointment outside of the facility. I brought Lynn home occasionally for 3 or 4 days at a time, although the consequences of that were 14 days in quarantine when he went back to the facility.
I'm Kat Stanty. I'm a qualified medication aide for a skilled nursing facility. I worked on the COVID unit during the pandemic. The facility stopped window visits so that families looking in could not report what they saw inside. But this caused the residents to become more isolated. More people in nursing homes were dying of neglect during 2020 to 2021 than they were dying of COVID. But no one on the outside of the facility knew that because we wouldn't let them see it.
I'm Julie Ryan. My mom lost her ability to walk independently after the lockdown. That led to her being put on hospice. When hospice allowed me to visit, she began to improve.
My name is Ann Hathaway. My father, 97 years old, was a decorated World War II veteran. My parents entered the assisted living facility in October of 2019 and were completely independent until the lockdown in March of 2020. Driving, eating out, visiting friends and family. After being isolated from their family members, their pastor and friends, even their fellow residents, for over a year. My mother's dementia increased exponentially, and she was never the same and passed away that next year.
My name is Marla Carter. My mother-in-law was one of the few fortunate nursing home residents who had a cell phone. So when the visiting restrictions of the pandemic first started, we were able to communicate with her. Soon, though, she stopped answering her phone. And if we were able to get her on the phone, she could no longer carry on a conversation. When we questioned the staff about this, they always told us she was doing just fine. Months later, we discovered that the nursing home had made medication changes without consulting us, including discontinuing her thyroid medication entirely, which caused her to go into a kind of a coma. Once we intervened and got her meds corrected, her mentation did improve, but she will never walk again due to months of inactivity and the fact that her brain basically forgot how to walk.
My name is Beth Frith, and my mother was in a nursing home rehab facility just before lockdown and died a year later. I went from seeing her every day and monitoring her care to being allowed to see her once. After 5 months, a doctor told me that her foot would probably have to be amputated, not because of circulatory issues, but because inadequate, neglected wound care of a pressure sore. I took her home to my house on hospice.
I'm Janie Gendron. I'm a licensed clinical social worker in the state of Maine. Pre-pandemic, I visited my mother daily in her nursing home. And because she had dementia, it was impossible to explain to her during the lockdown why I couldn't be with her. And when my mother was on her deathbed in November 2020, I was allowed a 30-minute visit. And when I refused to leave, the administrator yelled at me at my dying mother's bedside and tried to kick me out. And my mother died within the hour.
I'm Monica Fish, and I'm an occupational therapist. I brought my mother to a facility in May of 2021 after a stroke left her with the loss of use of one arm and one leg. CMS was allowing daily visitation by then, but the administrator didn't allow visitation until I fought for it and showed them the CMS guidelines. By then, my mother had lost the use of both arms.
My name is Dawn O'Gara. I was a caregiver for my father. My father was in a nursing home in 2020 during the pandemic lockdown. The consequences of him being isolated were absolutely horrible. My father had frontotemporal degeneration and he was nonverbal. He could not advocate for his own care and we were not allowed in. He quickly declined due to the lack of care by the staff. There were numerous times we sat outside his window calling the facility to try to get someone in his room to check on him. One time we found him bleeding and another time we could hear him wheezing. He was dirty and dehydrated when we removed him from the facility. I know we were lucky in comparison to many others because we were able to bring him home before it was too late.
I'm Kathleen McCartney. I'm a registered nurse. My mom fell and entered a facility during COVID. She became very anxious without me. My mother fell 4 times within a 2-week period and received 2 emergency room visits to treat open head wounds. She was prescribed antipsychotic medication. She was left in the hallway to be watched by staff and contracted COVID. She met the criteria for compassionate care visits, but was denied these visits by the facility. My dear mother was not treated with compassion.
This is Donna Lauer from Minnesota. My partner of 15 years, Tom, had a debilitating stroke in 2018, which eventually left him with the use of only his left arm and hand. I was not allowed in to visit Tom for almost a year. He was kept isolated from me, even by phone. Before that, I'd been with him almost every day, including at hospitals and 3 other nursing homes. The facility ignored my requests for compassionate care visits and denied my requests for essential caregiver visits. I complained to the Minnesota Department of Health, which did me no good. The investigator they sent out refused to look at any of my evidence, phone calls, emails, and letters, saying instead that she would talk to the people there. I received a form email from MDH stating my claims couldn't be substantiated, even as they were ongoing. They were still keeping me out. Staff prevented me from being with him, so he died alone in the middle of the night, April 19th, 2022.
I'm Kim Prakniak. My mom's facility administrator said 100% of the residents declined from the isolation. My mom forgot how to use the TV remote. She could barely answer the phone, and with no mental, emotional, or spiritual stimulation, and no physical touch, she lost her will to live.
I'm Verna Nelson. I couldn't have window visits to see my mom during the lockdown because she lived on the second floor. Window visits were me looking up at her in her second floor balcony, with traffic noise in the background preventing any conversation. Because she had dementia, visits with technology didn't work.
I'm Elizabeth Urbach. Although I was my mother's court-appointed guardian, I was denied physical access to her for 2 years, supposedly to keep her from getting COVID. During those 2 years, my mother in her late 80s caught COVID twice from the nursing home staff. I, on the other hand, did not catch COVID.
My name is Scott McMurray. My mother lives in a skilled nursing facility in Nebraska, and my sister and I spend time and help her with whatever she needs. She entered the facility in January 2022. By then, visitors were allowed in, but periodic 2-week lockdowns have since occurred when there were COVID outbreaks in the facility. During that time, we had friends who had loved ones in nursing homes and stood outside on the frozen, snowy ground, speaking to their family member through an open window, just to see that they were okay and have some conversation, not to mention the lingering mental anguish that it caused.
I'm Carolyn Piper. My mother, Annabelle, had a devastating stroke in her late 80s. My father, Charles, also in his late 80s, moved into assisted living in the same building as her nursing home and visited her every single day. During the lockdown, he was prohibited from seeing her for months. We begged that he be allowed compassionate visits, but this was denied because the CMS regulations on this were so vague. My parents would have rather died than be separated, totally alone and isolated at the end of their lives.
I'm Julia O'Brien. In May of 2016, my grandmother had a stroke, which caused her to need skilled nursing care. She lived the remainder of her days in a nursing home, visited daily by family until she passed away in November of 2020, after spending 8 months in isolation and losing all quality of life. It was isolation that proved to be more dangerous and debilitating than any virus.
My name is Kathy Carlton. I'm a nurse practitioner working in long-term care and subacute facilities. I personally witnessed the devastation of COVID as it spread through my facilities and the cruelty of isolation experienced by family members and the residents. This was a human rights violation. My aunt was in a subacute during lockdown, became septic, and passed 2 days later.
I'm Dina Duquesne from New Mexico. I brought my mom home 3 months after the facility locked down. Prior to the memory care closure, I visited with my mother every day. Even though mom was in a private room, I was only permitted a 15-minute window visit once per week through a dirty window. Mom's health and mental acuity quickly declined. She thrived once I took her home. But my mother's friend at the facility died due to the isolation and failure to thrive. Her daughter was not even allowed access to her mother when she was actively dying.
I'm Carla Conley. In 2021, I asked my representative, Claudia Tenney, to introduce the Essential Caregivers Act so that what happened to my mom during the COVID lockdowns wouldn't happen to anyone again. I was denied compassionate care visits to my mom until September 27th of 2020. That's when I fought for 7 hours to get her to the emergency room, where she was diagnosed with sepsis, severe dehydration, a stage 3 pressure ulcer, renal failure, high sodium levels, and swelling of the brain. She passed away a week later.
My name is Bill Lamb, and I'm a volunteer advocate with North Carolina Friends of Residents in Long-Term Care. I vividly remember speaking with a man whose wife was in a facility with end-stage dementia. This man told me he came to his wife's facility every day to feed her every meal before the lockdowns. One day he went and was refused entry because the facility was complying with the imposed visitation restrictions. When he could no longer come in, his wife became agitated, combative, and she stopped eating. She died 1 month later of malnutrition, not COVID.
My name is Sandra Sanford, and I reside in Bismarck, North Dakota. In 2020, there were efforts to safeguard nursing home residents that ultimately injured them. This was personal to me. I had family and friends who were locked in nursing homes. That included 2 of my grandmothers. One became so injured and neglected that our family had to remove her from the North Dakota nursing home.
I'm Lynn Meldon. I couldn't see my mom except for 3 short visits totaling 90 minutes between March of 2020 to March of 2021. At Christmas, when she learned she wouldn't be allowed to spend it with me, she responded, "This is wrong. I have never not spent Christmas with my family." She also was not allowed to leave her facility for a total of 415 days. She commented she felt like a prisoner.
I'm Summer Ryder. My mother went into a new nursing home shortly before the pandemic started because she had a major stroke, which caused her to lose control of one side. She didn't get to acclimate to the new surroundings and people with her family because of the lockdown. She's hard of hearing, so phone visits wouldn't work. And at window visits, she would cry, "Why can't you guys come in?" She got more and more confused because she has bipolar and dementia. She kept saying she was kidnapped and she would call the police. I even tried to get compassionate care visits through an ombudsman, but I was denied that. My mother caught COVID in December 2020 because of a staff member. In April 2021, I finally got in and saw a world of difference in my mom between March 2020 and April 2021.
I'm Amy Massingale. I took my parents out of the facility 2 weeks after the lockdowns began. They had to sleep in the living room of my home, and I had a full-time job, so it was extremely difficult. I soon found another facility near me, but it wasn't much better. It also denied me access to my parents. My mom passed away in May of 2020, and while I watched through the window, and my dad passed away 11 months later.
I'm Leslie Atherholt. After my mom's facility locked down from COVID, not only did she lose her family advocates, she forgot who we are. By December 2020, she got COVID from a staff member. She died alone.
My name is Charlie Galligan. We put my mom in a nursing home around the corner, and my dad came to live with my saintly wife, Carrie, and me to facilitate our daily visits and care of my mom at the nursing home. After the nursing home COVID lockout, it took me and others over a year to force the state of Rhode Island and the industry to allow us back in to see mom. Even in her diminished capacity, my mother realized that dad was no longer the same, having spent a year without a real visit with her. "Why won't daddy tell me he loves me anymore?" she'd plead with me. Answer that to a traumatically brain-injured woman who's been married for 60 some odd years. For us, it would have been preferable had they been able to maintain their daily contact and both get COVID and die. I'm still haunted by staff at the nursing home putting my mom on the phone with me just around the corner, begging me to come back in to take care of her.
My name is Penny Easley. This is my sister who had cerebral palsy and severe scoliosis. Her mind was intact. This is Chrissy after 4 months of lockdown. I managed rental property, and it was ironic that my tenants worked in the facility could get in, but I was not allowed in. After lockdown, my sister had PTSD every time COVID was mentioned because she knew she would be locked up for at least 2 weeks.
I'm Tracy Hoff. I was not allowed on the property of my parents' facility during the COVID lockdowns. I was only allowed in after my father had a fall and was unresponsive. When I saw him, he was moaning and obviously in pain. I asked for hospice, but they never came. The facility did not give him anything to ease his discomfort, and he passed away 3 days later. I called hospice to ask why they didn't come, and they said the facility never sent them an order.
I'm Risha Oliphant. My mother couldn't see her family during window visits because of the sun and couldn't hear us because of the noisy air vents near the window. She didn't have dementia prior to the pandemic, but within 3 weeks of the lockdown, she declined mentally, thought she was in prison, and had scary hallucinations that immediately stopped when we had access to her again.
In 2020, Texas families introduced the concept of essential caregivers to our legislature and successfully worked to get essential caregivers incorporated in emergency visitation guidelines, state law, and in the Texas Constitution as the 35th Amendment to the Texas Bill of Rights. No other state gives long-term care residents the constitutional right to in-person access during a declared emergency. I'm Mary Nichols, and for 202 days, my mother with advanced Alzheimer's spent the remainder of her cognition in isolation. For a time, even her hospice nurses and aides were declared non-essential.
I'm Jamie Gordon. My kids and I missed an entire year of my husband's life. He was in his 40s at the time of the lockdowns and had a rare brain illness called metachromatic leukodystrophy, which causes dementia and made him behave like a toddler. He also had type 1 diabetes. When we were allowed back after the year, he had lost the ability to feed himself, lost his mobility, and forgot who we were.
I'm Amy Saunders from Vermont. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. When I was denied access to my mom, she stopped eating, which resulted in significant weight loss, so she was admitted to hospice. I was told she was only eating 25% of her meal, and that was attributed to her dementia. When I was allowed to see her for outside visits, I was able to feed her. She went from eating 25% of her meal to eating 95 to 100% of it. I was able to take the time she needed to help her eat. Unfortunately, I was only allowed to go once a week. She died alone, and so did my mother-in-law due to the lockouts that lasted too long.
I am Crystal Tunmitzner. My son was living in a federally funded intermediate care facility during COVID. We were with him every day before the pandemic, went to every doctor's appointment with him, and provided direct care to him daily. The months of isolation from the COVID pandemic broke his spirit. He stopped making eye contact. His anxiety and depression worsened his physical and cognitive conditions, and he could not understand why we could not be with him. On his 13th birthday, he slept as we tried to wake him from his window.
My name is Kim Miller. During COVID, my mom lived in an assisted living facility. As the months of isolation went by, she declined both physically and mentally. After 6 months, she was no longer able to care for herself. She lost weight. She no longer remembered how to charge her cell phone, much less use it. She no longer remembered how to use her hearing aids. She no longer knew how to use her TV remote, brush her teeth, or take a shower. We brought her home so that we could take care of her in the way that she so desperately needed.
I'm Andrea Hudnall-Gold. My dad was Frederick Hudnall. He was 6 feet tall and lost so much weight during the lockdown that he only weighed 80 pounds. The nursing home didn't want to send him to the hospital, but I insisted he go because I noticed through the window that he looked gravely ill. The hospital said he had a heart attack from severe dehydration and malnutrition.
I'm Lori Griepentrog. I took a video of my mom dancing and singing to her favorite music shortly before the lockdown. A week after the lockdown, she lost her ability to speak and didn't eat anymore, except for little sips of liquid. She went on hospice a month after the lockdown, and my brother and I were only allowed in once she was unresponsive. She passed away the day before Mother's Day 2020, only 2 months after the lockdown started.
I'm Candace Sanderson Karn. My brother and sister-in-law regularly visited my mother in Wyoming before the lockdown. She kept calling and begging them and me to help her because she couldn't leave her room to ask a staff member for help. Whenever we called the facility to tell them, the short-staffed facility didn't answer the phone, and it just rang and rang.
Please support the Essential Caregivers Act.
Please support the Essential Caregivers Act.
Please support the Essential Caregivers Act.
Please support the Essential Caregivers Act. Thank you.
Please support the Essential Caregivers Act because these stories could be yours. Thank you.